Hello, you're listening to the SEL in Action podcast, the podcast where we explore what social and emotional learning looks like in educational and professional settings. I'm your host, Heather Woods, and today on episode 1, we will be talking about what social and emotional competencies are needed in a K-12 online learning context. We'll be speaking with Michelle Thomason, an educator from the UK. This episode is part of the Social and Emotional Competencies in Distance Leadership series. Michelle is a English media teacher and curriculum area leader in sixth form, so she is teaching 16 to 19-year-olds in the inner city, and she and she's been doing this for about 20 years, and she's now doing her doctorate in education whilst continuing to teach part-time. And her research is exploring the recent UK curriculum reforms to A-level media studies. So thank you so much, Michelle, for speaking to me and seeing my post and being
You're very welcome.
I really appreciate it. So we've been talking a little bit just via email and on social media about kind of what is covered underneath these social emotional competencies. And so there's a ton of diverse skills kind of included in this self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationship building, and decision-making. And so I wonder what skills you see as the most essential for yourself as an educator.
Yeah, I think it's important to have empathy for the students, actually, particularly since moving online under the current circumstances, is actually understanding that you no longer have that face-to-face opportunity to read them. You can see often when they walk into class and what moods they're in, and that kind of sort of emotional intelligence has been stripped away, and they're behind a screen now. And I think finding methods of communication that makes it safe for them to say how they're feeling and how they're trying to learn or not, and making it a safe space for them to say, I'm not doing this very well, or I can't, I'm not finding it easy, and I think that to me has been kind of like the major factor in those students who have engaged, those who have been really kind of consistent in their development online. That there have been a number of students who have kind of almost replicated their competencies from the classroom online, and in some ways actually enhanced them, because you can see that when going online, it strips bare quite a lot of the skills that students have, because you don't have the veneer of all the different the sort of the noise of the general kind of day. They're sort of going about their business in college and face to face, but then actually when all of that's taken away, what you're left with is the actual kind of raw skills that they have and how they actually learn. And that's been really interesting, quite depressing for some students to see that actually some of the ones that struggled in class anyway with self-management and sort of that self-efficacy of keeping to deadlines and structuring their time and things like that, that's just been exacerbated and magnified 100 times over since moving online, because they didn't have those skills kind of embedded properly beforehand. And it's just with that contact being taken away from their teachers, that they don't have that structure and support there. They're not being dragged along constantly to do that. And I think that's something that has been a real downside of this. But then on the upside, the students I was talking about just before who sort of developed really well. And in one incident I've got one student who, incredibly shy student, always been hardworking, always been kind of just keeping under the radar of doing all the work and everything, and she has just absolutely blossomed. It's been a joy to see, and her communication like she much prefers to talk via email, or we have these discussion forums online as well, and she can do it privately. And so, you know, the questions she's been asking, she would never have the confidence to ask in class. And so this kind of asynchronous way of working, but also you can kind of have it a bit live as well. So we've had live discussion forums, which she's not as keen on, but she likes to reflect on things. So I think, you know, to answer your question, I think, you know, it's understanding the students' strengths and how they feel about themselves as well, and their confidences in this process.
And so you kind of mentioned earlier at the start is creating that safe space for them to engage, but also, you know, be able to come to you if they're struggling with the situation. I mean, there's, you know, it's not just learning that they're struggling with at the moment. And so how do you go about creating that like engaging empathy and creating that space for them to kind of feel safe to be able to discuss things online with you?
Well, I think, you know, it's important that the relationships that we built beforehand are replicated online as well. And I think, you know, if these students were new to me, it would be really hard. It would be an uphill battle, because, you know, you can't forge a personal relationship or professional relationship with students if you don't already have that in real life. And so I guess, you know, these students I've taught for at least most of the year, and some students 2 years. And so there's already a foundation there. And so we already have a kind of shared way of working. They understand how I deal with things, you know, and so I would try and be consistent, or I have been consistent in terms of I'd email them on a Monday morning as a kind of general, how are you, how's things going, checking in, that kind of thing. And then on the Tuesday, which was when we'd normally have a lesson, I'd email them with the work. And on the Monday, I'd warn them that's what was happening, and it would be consistent every week. So they would always expect to have that. And it would always be like a kind of a warm, you know, look, if you're struggling, just email me, you know, it's fine. We can just work through it, and we can organise, you know, Zoom meetings. And so we didn't, in the early days, actually, we didn't really have many live video calls. Partially because I think that's partly down to the leadership where I work, that they assumed that lockdown was going to last, say, 3 weeks or something. I don't know, and it was all a little bit. We tend to be quite optimistic about things, but unfortunately, which is quite strange being British, because we're not usually that optimistic about many things. But we certainly didn't think or hope that it was going to last as long as it actually has done. And we weren't prepared, I don't think, really, as a kind of institution to deal with the situations that has arisen. Now, as a media teacher, I feel like our department was a lot better prepared, because we do an awful lot of teaching and resources online. We use an online platform, and then the students have got more media literate kind of skills anyway. So I think they're used to some of the methods that we've taught. So I kind of think that when I was immediately contacting them in those first few weeks, it was just actually letting them also know that we were just finding a way through this and keeping them up to date with that we don't know all the answers. And I think it's that they can see that, you know, it's not a them and us situation, it's a shared experience, and that we're going to try and support them as much as possible. And, you know, I think, you know, there's always going to be those students who haven't engaged, and whatever strategies we chose, we're not going to really be that effective. So the pastoral side of things, I know we spent a lot of time ringing students individually if they weren't engaging, but they weren't picking up phones either, you know, so it was really difficult. And, you know, you can't go and doorstep them, so so, you know, it's I think we've managed to get through to about 90% of students now, and about 40% have engaged either very consistently or mostly over time. But yeah, the safe space, I think, is just about, you know, just trying to move that personal relationship online, and keeping that going, and just not telling them things, but just supporting
Mm-hmm.
them and asking them questions, and giving them an opportunity to respond.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then you mentioned earlier as well, kind of the like self-management and like time management stuff on behalf of your students. Are there any strategies that you're engaging with to kind of help foster these social emotional skills within your students through your online interactions?
Yeah, I mean, we're very transparent as to how we're doing this, and we're saying that these are the methods that we're using. Please talk to us if it's not working for you, and we try
Mm-hmm.
and make it bite-sized. So I think initially a lot of teachers were sending out work on a Monday for the whole week, and
Mm-hmm.
what students would have in their online platform inbox would be, if say these students doing say 3 A levels, and they would have basically about 6 teachers sending them work
Mm-hmm.
on a Monday morning, which would be probably over ambitious anyway, as teachers might be, and they were feeling really overwhelmed. So like we made sure in our department that we were kind of like stripping it back, so they would be sort of fed bite-sized chunks of learning, and that the expectations were that they could do things over a period of time, and that we would check in with them as to their progress, not necessarily the finished product of things
Mm-hmm.
like that. So so in terms of time management, that's how we kind of approached it, and we gave them the opportunity to do kind of like the live. So we never actually did live online teaching as such, not like you would do in a classroom.
Mm-hmm.
What we did was we would set them the work, they would go off and do it, and then the next week we would have like a question answer seminar style
Mm-hmm.
session. So they would come with things and we would ask them questions, and some of them would be able to answer them, some of them wouldn't, and they we could have a discussion and dialogue. So I suppose it's kind of like what you would have in a classroom, where you would get them to go off and do a task and activity, and then you would come back as a class and discuss it.
Mm-hmm.
And so that worked much better, and it was an easier space, I think, to do that in. And a lot of students don't like appearing on camera, so we gave them the option to not have the camera on and just to see us instead, and I think that kind of worked too. So time management really was kind of just a sort of variety of strategies, really, just to make sure that they were on board with that, and asking them, is this working for you? And if it's not, why?
Yeah. Yeah, engage in a little bit of self-reflection, and then
yeah, exactly,
help to guide them. So what would you say, would you say that time management is kind of the most pressing kind of social emotional skill, or is there a different one for your students to kind of help you, that you can kind of help them kind of build through this online learning situation? What do you think?
I think it varies. I think for some students it's about confidence. Actually, it's when I say confidence, what I mean is not as necessarily people, but the setup at home, to confidently work on their own and to know that they're doing the right things, and to be able to contact and communicate, and to if they're struggling, to email, because I still haven't been able to get through to some students who you email an email and you don't get response back. And then others, you get lots of emails and they're happy to, and they're very mature in the way that they talk to you. So I think confidence, but also, my students have very different background, working backgrounds in terms of environment, and some of them are sharing laptops with siblings. Parents are key workers out, and they're looking after their siblings, or they don't have consistent Wi-Fi, or they're trying to tap on their phones and it's just not working. And so I think confidence in that respect is that you have confidence in your environment, confidence in that you can actually get on and do the work, but that, and the confidence to tell somebody else like me that they don't have those, don't have an ideal kind of background to working environment to be able to do that. So I think that for some students, that's the major issue, and that's what we have to work around. But yeah, I think time management, for all of them to some degree despite the fact they've had nothing to do for 3 months other than schoolwork, you know, it's kind of, yeah, I think giving them strategies, and I think there does need to be some kind of online learning literacy after this. I think this is really important, that just because we make the wrong assumptions often in general, that young people, because they're on their phones all the time, that they actually understand how to use technology effectively, and they don't. You know,
No.
I don't like the term digital natives, because that assumes that everybody who is, you know, digitally native, it knows how to do it to the best ability. And of course we know that's not right. You know, all the issues with social media, and you know, actually what you've got is probably a whole load of teenagers sitting at home on their phones constantly scrolling through TikTok or YouTube, and not actually really fully critiquing what they're seeing, and it's a black hole of time for a lot of them. And I don't have anything against any of those social media platforms. I mean, I teach about them, but I think what I do have is that it tends to be detrimental to their mental health if they're just sitting there not being productive. You know, they enter that kind of scroll hole and they can't get out of it, and then it's addictive as well, and their brains kind of get set into this mode of not being able to manage their time, and actually, you know, doing their schoolwork isn't as exciting as potentially these little hits of what they're seeing online. So I think the media literacy angle, which obviously is my background anyway, is really important. I think online literacies for learning really need to take a front seat when we go back to whatever normal is going to look like. So yeah, and time management is part of that. But how do you manage your time online? You know, that is not, and how do you balance it with not being online? You know, because there's this sort of obsession with, you know, Zoom and Teams and, you know, everything, and everyone, this, you know, you've got this seemingly brand new technology that everyone is now using really seamlessly, but it doesn't necessarily, once that kind of novelty wears off, what we left with, how, you know, where's the pedagogical value in all of these things?
Yeah, it was really interesting. Actually, yesterday I sent a check-in video to my own students, so graduate students, and they were talking about, on their discussion boards, we're talking about coping right now, with teaching and leading at a distance. And we're talking about mindfulness and that sort of thing. And one of the students actually brought up, and so I brought it up in my check-in to them, was, you know, these students that, or individuals that were born, you know, in the 90s, and they've grown up with this technology. Mindfulness is very hard to do, because they don't know how to disengage from the technology, right? Like you and I, like, we didn't have all of this technology when we were growing up, right? So it was very, very different. And but, you know, I think it's important to acknowledge also that even though we didn't have that necessarily growing up, you know, we're inundated with the Teams and Zoom and all this stuff right now. And particularly you and I. So I also study digital literacies. So very akin to the media studies. So yeah, like, we're interested in this stuff and we're looking at it, and, you know, it's not, it's definitely playing into, I mean, all my productivity stuff relies on technology half the time.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, nothing like good old pen and paper sometimes too.
My planner has moved to pen and paper, and my husband actually the other day mentioned, like, why don't you just do this in Google Calendar? And I was like, it takes me away from the computer, and I can just sit there and, like, thoughtfully think about my week.
Exactly. And I think it engages different parts of the brain in different ways, because it's like, you know, if you try reading on a screen, it's very different to reading an actual physical book, and the processes, the kind of synapses that kind of, you know, keep sparking are very different, you know, in those different situations. And I think, you know, for students to constantly be at almost like the beck and call of technology, because they're so used to having it at their fingertips and reliant on it as well. You know, obviously there's huge benefits to that, and for them to be digitally literate in those ways, but it's this very immediate world that we live in that you probably just heard that, you know, another thing pings on as notifications, and your immediate reaction, isn't it, is particularly for a student, is you're in the middle of a conversation and then you press the notification or the text message or the WhatsApp message, and your attention is constantly diverted. And I think eventually the kind of the brains are going to be programmed to not be able to concentrate in those kind of intensive periods where you need to just focus on things. And so that's quite challenging, I think, particularly when you're teaching. I mean, I know in the class, even in the classroom, you know, students have got one eye on their phones.
Oh yeah.
You know, and they know they're not allowed to use it, but it lights up and you see it in their faces, you know. And then if they're online, you don't have that kind of eyes on you to guard against that. So they're going to be diverted all the time. And so even students who are good at time management, they're still going to have those pressures and the extra kind of, you know, noise in their heads that are going to kind of make it difficult for them to do that.
So I think this might be a very big question. Do you have ideas or a way that you can structure or strategies that you can include while you're online teaching to kind of help foster like this engagement and maybe self-reflection on their time management strategies or that sort of thing? I don't think I've come up with a fail-safe strategy yet, and I'm not sure when that will ever happen. I think probably I could retire when that does happen. But again, just I think going back to that thing I sort of said right at the beginning is communication, and trying to foster them not seeing themselves as individuals but part of a group and a dynamic that actually they share. So, you know, the discussion forums that we've operated have been really good, and I've tried to kind of reply to one student but then bouncing it to another student in the group and saying, you know, you've been doing this work, how do you feel about what X has said, and trying to kind of keep a conversation and dialogue going, I think, because that's the sort of the type of communications you have online are very different to face to face. You know, that even, you know, we're talking on a one-to-one now, but we're still reliant on that kind of, you know, the yellow box switching and knowing when to turn take. And actually you can read people a lot better in a room than you can on a screen. And, you know, your natural ways of communicating perhaps change a little bit. You know, I probably talk too much anyway, and I'm, you know, it's but it's much harder to read, and for students to get that new form of communication and modes of communication is going to be a skill for their future actually as well. You know, that this is, in some ways, whilst we've been forced to do all of this very quickly and probably, you know, slightly clunkily, it has actually catapulted us all into a new way of working, and students will have this as their normal in their employment for the future. And so in some ways those who've engaged with it now and understand how it kind of intersects with face-to-face learning and the home environment. Again, I think this is important as well, the blending. We talk about blended learning, but I also think, you know, the blending of the professional and the personal, or the you know, your school life and your home life, and suddenly where these two things were pretty separate, you're suddenly having to kind of deal with everything in one space, and that's an interesting concept. So yeah, I think the strategies just always go back to communication and dialogue, and just a variety, and, you know, things that are going to get students to do independent learning, to talk to each other, to want to, you know, improve on what they, you know, they get the feedback obviously as well from,
their assignments that they put online. And again, that creates a dialogue. I think actually my feedback to them has been 100% better than it would be normally, because I've had slightly more time, because we're much more focused on the individuals. But you can actually have a dialogue online on the learning platform that we use. So instead of me handwriting marks on an essay, I'm actually writing in a box which they then can respond to. So we're immediately doing these kind of dirt reflection tasks. They've got that as a kind of an option, really. And so that gives them confidence. And it gives them more awareness of how they're actually doing, and you can actually see physically they've got all their work in one place, and so they can actually see their progress.
Yeah, I mean, that it touches on so many pieces of social emotional competencies, right? Like you're fostering perspective taking and social awareness and reflection, and fostering their self-efficacy and confidence and being able to do this on their own. Our learning platform at the university doesn't allow for a lot of like back and forth feedback.
Right. Okay.
So like I create a Google Doc for all my students, and then so we can have that dialogue going back and forth. If they so wish, they don't have to, but they're always getting formative feedback from me in that space, which I think it is critical for building their confidence and building their ability to, or comfort in maybe thinking outside the box a little bit, because they know that they can kind of bounce those ideas with me.
Exactly.
Right.
And I guess it goes back to that idea about safe space. They can take risks. I had one student who completely got something entirely wrong and completely misunderstood what I was asking him to do, and we were able to have that conversation in a private space, away from any other eyes in the classroom, and I was able to tackle those misconceptions. And she came back, and actually she might have felt really embarrassed and ashamed that she'd got something so badly wrong. But actually, we did it in a very easy, kind of supportive way, and she came back with a brilliant piece of work from that. And I guess there are kind of elements of being online, away from people. You can hide if you want to, in some respects, and do your thinking in private, and that kind of works. And particularly that student I was saying before, who's really blossomed. I mean, she's it's outstanding work she's produced, and she's clearly just gone away and thought about things. She's had the time. And it got to the point where I was talking to my teaching partner. We were saying, God, she's probably better off just staying online for the rest of the year, because I think actually being in the classroom with us is counterproductive to her. We were like a little bit kind of, So there are people like that who really, really understand and love that. And I suppose it depends on your personality type. So kind of introverted people, flourish often in these environments, whereas extroverts, are kind of, I don't want to see it as a binary of introversion, extroversion, because I know there's obviously massive spectrums of personality within that. But I think generalizing, people who feed off communication and people and contact, that I think those are the people who've really suffered, actually, and their learning is directly predicated on that kind of nourishment of human contact. And whereas others, they flourish because they really don't have to, speak to anybody and be with anybody. So it's almost like recharging the batteries in different ways, So that's kind of interesting to see. But I do think that there needs to be, when we go back, a course almost, or a program of like and I don't want to use this phrase in the way that it sounds, but reinstitutionalizing students, and that's a horrible phrase to use, but do you know what I mean, like reinstating them back into a kind of learning mode that they and understanding how to use online, understanding how to effectively manage their time, and what happens if they don't feel confident, what happens if they are not working to the best of their ability, who do they go to, what support networks do they have, and that sort of communication as well. It's a maturity thing as well. This idea of like students being able to say to their teachers, "Hi, how are you?" Oh yeah, that's the other thing as well, thinking about it. The students who've done the best, i.e. who've engaged consistently, are the ones who do email and go, actually, that these are the emails that you see. Hi Michelle, they call each other, we call it our first name. So it's, hi Michelle, hope you're well. How are you? ? I'm just wondering if you could help me with X, Y, and Z. Or does this have to be in by such and such date? And it's a light touch kind of quite a mature style of communication from a 16-year-old who, for the person that's next to them normally in the class can't, really engage like that. You often get emails from them that don't start with a greeting. I'm not necessarily that bothered about, all the niceties, but you can kind of see how their communications are developing as a result of this, and how they can understand to communicate with other people. So
it's I think moving into this like pandemic and emergency online teaching, it's really highlighted all these other skills that maybe we didn't focus on so much in the classroom. But yeah, like you said, we now need to, when we bring them back, kind of reintegrate and rethink about how we structure this, not only for if this happens again, but planning for the future, and knowing that, we're likely going to keep a lot of things online, even in professional lives, right? So,
well, I mean, there's one big college in London that my friend is at. She teaches there, and they're not going back until January. They're doing all online learning until January, because it's in central London, and the students don't want the students to be getting on public transport. And so that's really interesting. And then I know we had a meeting earlier on this week from my place, and we're having the option of 2 timetables next year. So we've got, you mentioned sort of 3 ones, didn't you, for your place?
The university. Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, no, I mean, what the one is, the option of being face-to-face full-time, and the other one is a blended learning, where the students will come in for blocks of time during the week, and then they'll go home, and then some of the learning will be online in the afternoon. And we've also made a decision to move away from the learning platform that we've been using as well, because that's not conducive. So it's interesting, this kind of technological determinism aspect of like how students learn, and actually the platform we have been using, which is a pretty common one, but it just hasn't worked. It's too clunky. It's a bit counterintuitive when you're using it. And if we find that difficult as staff, then students will find it quite difficult too. So we're moving Google Classroom, and hopefully, I mean, I'm sure there'll be issues with that as well, but I think, I've used it with my kids for their school, and it seems a lot more seamless than. So it's interesting how the technology also will change the way students feel about themselves and their confidence. I mean, I'm fully expecting them to be quite anxious and underconfident about using new technology, particularly when they've had such a stressful few months trying to battle with everything else. So that's going to be a challenge as well, getting them to feel like confident again to be able to use new technology. But again, we'll all be using it for the first time too. So I think, learning with the students is important, and them to understand that it's all kind of like a going along with the flow together. So yeah.
Excellent. Well, I'm conscious of your time. I know you're on a tight schedule, so I do really appreciate this, but I think you really highlighted some strategies and some competencies and skills that are really, really important to the shift to online, with empathy and consistency in your communication and expectations. We talked about, building students' confidence through feedback, and, a lot of it comes down to communication strategies, which, I mean, I've talked about quite a bit in my course, and just the consistency, the tone that you're using, and creating that social climate where students are feeling safe and engaged, and aware that they're not alone, that there are other students that are going through this, that you're there with them in it, and demonstrating your vulnerability in the sense that you're figuring this out too at the same time
absolutely.
as they are. So yeah, I think it's really highlighted a lot of these key skills that not only ourselves as educators need to implement and think about, but also how we can foster that with our students. So I really, really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me today.
You're very welcome.
Thanks for listening to the SEL in Action podcast with Heather Woods. If you like the show and want to know more, check out SEL-in-action.com or leave us a review on iTunes. Be sure to follow SEL in Action on Facebook and Twitter for updates on our podcast. I'll talk to you soon.